Oh, thank you, Herbie, and thank you again, Barbara, for having us into this forum, which we're very excited to be here and to be able to talk about our journey with the story of W.G. Raymond. And just as a very brief overview, for those who were not able to attend yesterday, W.G. Raymond was a Civil War figure that was also an extended relative of ours, a great grandfather on her mother's side. And he ultimately was appointed by Lincoln to appoint the first federal regiment of African American Union troops in Washington, D.C., and which he did. And then there was a bit of a shuffle that occurred that led to the development of the United States Colored Troops, or the USCT. And there was some history that was lost over a period of about 3 weeks. And we've researched that period of time. But in our book, WG goes on to a life out west and gets involved in a variety of pursuits. And during this time, as we mentioned, he had developed a severe addiction to opium, and which was kind of new to us to understand in terms of it being so prevalent back in the mid-19th century as it was. But what I'll say is that as when we completed this book, that without question, the two most prominent inquiries we got from readers had to do with opium and its prevalence and how it came to be, and the sort of history of it. And the second was WG's family life, how he had 10 children, but yet he was in multiple wives, but then he was out fighting in the Civil War and faith healing and so forth. How did the family survive? And was this family typical of that time period during the Civil War? So today's presentation will focus on the first question, which was around opium. And tomorrow's session will center on the family, not only of W.G. Raymond, but also in general about that time period, how families got along as so many of them were broken by the Civil War and the needs of people to enlist and so on, and injuries and so forth. And injuries kind of lead us into the story of opium during the Civil War.
Yes, and I think in our research, and in reviewing WG's own memoir, his own book, which was published in 1892, he was remarkably candid about the use of opium, and there wasn't a ton of detail in his own account of what the times were like or how it was administered or what it was like. But because he was so transparent about saying how it influenced his life, we felt that we needed to really dig into it to understand it better, and we chose to put that right on, as you can see with the cover of the book, that he did fight an opium addiction as a pistol-toting preacher who raised the first federal African American Union troops. A lot of attention in the present era focuses on opium. Those of us who've been involved in reading the newspaper or in our own communities, we've seen the scourge of this. Opium is a huge problem. It remains a huge problem. And along with it, in the present time, we're going to look at the crisis that really began so long ago. And we're going to look at the perfect storm that created it, that created the opium problem. We're going to consider the need and what came to the rescue. Why was opium so important during the Civil War times? And then we'll look at how the government responded. And the main thing is the need was obvious because the Civil War was fought in such close quarters. And the wounds were horrific, as we discussed yesterday, in part because the weaponry was the kind that would tear big holes in people's bodies, between the bayonets and also the mini balls that were employed during the Civil War. The wounds were awful, and there were people who lost their limbs. The pain was awful that people dealt with, and there were so many casualties. As we had said, the people that flooded into Washington, where all the makeshift hospitals were in dire need, and mostly what they had from the accounts that we could read is available to them was alcohol, and biting a bullet, kind of like the biting of the bullet, proverbially spoken. And then along came during this very time. Opium's been around forever, as we basically know. It was traded early on. I'm going to do a quick back step here and just say people found that in the era of the mariners and the people who did trade with the Far East, that they could move opium from the poppy fields of far away and sell it, and it made wealth for a lot of the Boston Brahmins, for example. A lot of the hospitals that they named during the early part of the development of our country, those hospitals were sometimes funded by the proceeds from the sale of opium. But now we're in the Civil War times. And what is happening? We've got people moving into new territories. So people who grew up in Pennsylvania were now on the battlefield in Maryland. And that introduced people to different pathogens. And the fact that they were housed together, often in bad conditions, living in the camps and so forth, there was a lot of disease. And as we said, pain from gangrene, pain in dealing with smallpox and typhus. And when of course, that chronic diarrhea and malnutrition was common. And all of those could be somewhat addressed by a medication that came to the fore known as opium, or morphia, or morphine, also laudanum. It went by different names. They did mix the opium with alcohol, and that was laudanum, and people were able to get some pain relief from that. They developed tinctures. And what happened is there were no regulations. If you think of it, at the time, the government hadn't realized and maybe they should have, but the government hadn't realized the propensity of some, and actually the propensity of many, to in a fairly short time become addicted and habituated in the use of it. The injured and dying soldiers were often met with people coming to their aid who were not really technically physicians, because people were enlisted to help deal with the wounds as best they could. Even W.G. Raymond, who was not trained as a medical person, but was trained as a chaplain and worked in these hospitals, he describes in his own writings of actually helping to perform a surgery where they removed part of a man's skull and then had to get it cleared with under the skull, and then reposition the skull as best they could and stitch him up. So there were a lot of people who were operating in these makeshift hospitals and on the battlefield who really didn't have proper training. They were trying to save lives. And the weapon that you see here, this is actually a sign of what was used to help amputate limbs in order to save lives. There was a shortage. When we say ambulances, there was a shortage of ambulances. It was, and in fact, you can see in the picture, they were really wagons, not anything we would consider today as an ambulance. They were wagons. And a lot of times there were civilian drivers. And if a person who was running the civilian ambulance was unable to get people onto the bed of the wagon, they could be left behind on the battlefield. they also weren't well trained in driving and moving people who had been injured. So you just see it was a really chaotic backdrop. And along with that, there weren't as many nurses. There hadn't been as much education. So the nurses a lot. There were Dorothea Dix, you'll hear of her. There were others, Clara Barton. But the challenge was the Confederacy or the Union would capture the other side's nurses in order to beef up their own ranks, trying to help their own wounded. So you can see an image on the screen of what one of the makeshift hospitals, actually that one looks pretty decent. The one on the right is more right on the battlefield situation on the outskirts of a battle. So what had happened is Secretary of War Stanton had issued a national call encouraging doctors and nurses to step forward to be on the front and on the battlefield. And what we ended up with was a flood of unqualified volunteers. And the volunteers also drove the ambulances. And lo and behold, people began to understand that they could sell some of the medicines and the liquor. And so they were raiding the available medicines that people had in order to sell them or use them on their own. The suffering was so intense, and the wounded were scattered about. And we're most familiar with the situation in Washington because that was where most of our research occurred. Most of our storyline developed in Washington. And as we said yesterday, the schools, warehouses, hotels, even the Capitol Rotunda had beds, and there were soldiers in these beds. And you can imagine the sounds and the smells and the fear, and
Terrible.
it was an awful experience.
One point I'd like to go back to, we had it on one of the slides about the implementation of new types of weaponry at the time, and new is a stretch of the word, but it was kind of still very primitive. But during the Civil War, there was a lot of use of mini balls, they call them, or cannonballs, that would just, as you can imagine, it's just a ball of lead, just, flung through you. And it led to just absolutely, horrific injuries that were very difficult to treat before gangrene and all of that would set in. And then there was a lot of hand-to-hand combat. There were a lot of knives, there were a lot of beating with whatever they could get, and whatever, riflery they had at that time. So the backdrop is just very clearly, just a horrendous amount of horrific injury.
Yes, and so what do you think comes to the rescue? Couple of things. They didn't have anything available that would really deal with the kind of pain that they were seeing. One thing that you can say about opium is that it helps with, and I don't mean to be gross, but it helps with diarrhea. If you've ever had surgery and you've taken anything that has oxy in it, you've taken some form of opium, and it's very effective, but it will immediately kind of stop you up, as they say. So people on the battlefield who had all these diseases and things that were passing around, pathogens, different ones, that they did suffer chronic diarrhea. And they found very quickly that opium helped to stem that. And so what the beauty of it at the time was, it was an extremely effective pain reliever. It was inexpensive, it was unregulated, and it was effective. And now you put that perfect part of the storm together with the fact that there were new and improved delivery systems. For the first time, hypodermic needles were able to be used. There was a doctor in Scotland his last name was Wood, and he developed the hypodermic needle. And during the Civil War times is when they were able to start using it. And the combination of having tinctures, as we said, laudanum, where it was mixed with alcohol, even powder was used to treat, and it was freely available and freely given. So this one federal surgeon who was working the lines with all of the people on the battlefields found a unique way of dispensing it. And what he would do is he would ride through on horseback and have the morphine powder on his hand. And the patients or the people who were in the field who felt they needed it would lick his hand as he rode by them. So you can imagine what that did. So an assistant for a surgeon for the Confederate Army would ask, how are your bowels? Because as I said, a lot of people suffered from diarrhea. If they were suffering from diarrhea, they got opium. If they were constipated, they got a mercury pill, no matter what the situation. And now today we know there's definitely issues with mercury pills. President Lincoln himself took them. They were called the little blue pills, and they started to create some paranoia and other things in the people who took them. But at the time, it was viewed as a sort of help to the woes on the field. So we come to our subject, W.G., who was a Civil War soldier, a father at this time. He enlisted when he was 43 as an infantryman. He served as a chaplain. He served a provost guard. But he had always had stomach, bladder, and kidney issues. And he was the kind of person who would meet people and form relationships with them. And that helped him in so many different ways. But what happened during this time is there was a guy who was a physician, a highly regarded guy. His name was Dr. James Kent, and he was a homeopath. And he was originally from the Philadelphia area. But anyway, he found W.G. in a terrible way. He was in deep agony. I won't get into the specifics. It was gross, but it's in the book. And the doctor was very, very concerned about him. And in fact, he thought at this time, the doctor did, that perhaps W.G. was going to lose his life. And so he gave him opium for the pain that he was in. And that was the first time that W.G. had used it. He had seen it being used when he was working as a chaplain in the Washington, D.C. hospitals. He had seen it when he was on the front lines, but he himself had not taken it. And very soon after he got the relief that it provided, he became aware that, as he put it, his habit was fixed. And this is the double-edged sword that's known as opium, because
that was
doesn't take
one of the
long.
most compelling parts of his autobiography that we based our work largely on, was his owning up to the addiction. But he discussed at the very beginning how he was really addicted from the very beginning. He knew that it profoundly was going to change his life. His suffering, which had been chronic and constant, was now seemed to be under control. And he knew that this was, the habit was fixed, as Donna said.
He wrote of it really well and painfully, and we include some of that in the book. And also, I might be getting ahead of myself here a little bit with the slides, but I read an account. People at the time, as they started to become aware that the opium, while it had provided pain relief, was now creating problems for the people who used it and for their families, because as people became dependent upon it, they often would retreat from their families. They often were focused on trying to get more of it. And as you can see on the slide that's available to you right now, it was even sold by Sears. And the cost wasn't terribly expensive. People could take it and could expend their money in order to get it. And I'm going to fast forward here for a second and just tell you that one of the challenges with the present day opium situation is once people found that they couldn't get opium from their physicians, this would be in our present day time, they often turned to the streets and started using heroin, which is a form of morphine, and because it was cheaper. And you know where that problem left. I mean, people were willing to steal and beg and borrow to get a hold of it and buying it off the street. But in the counts that we read of for example, a Confederate soldier who was held, he was a Union soldier who was held by the Confederacy as a prisoner of war. And they didn't feed him well, as you might imagine. They left him in the sun for extended periods. And they also left him in the cold for extended periods. And the only relief that that man ever found was in opium. And he said until he realized this man who was held by the Confederacy, until he realized that the opium itself was more dangerous to him and more horrible than any monster he had ever imagined. And this is a succinct way that W.G. described his own experience with it. He said, "My only relief being by the use of opium, which I was seldom without. When suffering, I would give a large sum rather than be without it." Oh, and
This is the
what
story that
they,
Donna just referred to of the other Civil War soldier. But you can see with his actual quote there, he described it as he found himself in the fangs of a monster more terrible than the Hydra of Lerna, and whose protean powers it is not man's to know until it is too late to escape. We came across several very sort of descriptive ways of communicating the grip that opium had on people, and it was fascinating to read because it was clearly life altering, and the level of creativity they put into describing it is something that catches your attention as we were doing the research.
and when that soldier who had been held by the Confederacy, when he was actually trying to quit taking it, the description that he wrote, this was in a book called Confessions. It was contained within a book called Confessions of an Opium Eater, and that was published in 1876. But this fellow said he lost complete command of himself. And if there's anything that must be frightening to someone who's been on a battlefield, who's trained with his fellow soldiers, is to be without any command of yourself. And he said it felt like his skin, his flesh was being stretched tightly. And if you read present day accounts of people going through withdrawal, it's similar. Your limbs ache. And he felt hopeless upon a dark and boundless sea, drifting further from land. And today we do have, they were called opium eaters. And it was true that thousands of people, not just soldiers, but farmers and mothers, died from overdoses between 1865 and 1900. So what they started, now they're recognizing, and again, this is the period just after the Civil War and into early 1900, again, before any narcotic acts had really been put into place, or before people had fully understood how challenging the use of this medication was. So there started to be these inebriety clinics. And the challenge with this is, just like today, it's easy to do, but people who have not dealt with that kind of hold on their system tend to view it more from a perception of moral weakness, or it's a willpower thing. It's not good for you. Well, why can't you just quit it? Well, now we know there's very delicate ways you have to bring someone out of their addiction, and you use medications to help with that. But at the time they opened these clinics, it was the first step in trying to deal with the addictions that had developed. But people had a terrible time because when you do start to detox, you're in agony, and the reuse rates back in the late 1800s were as high as what we've heard of today. Now, how did this impact things? The really challenging component of it is you've got people who are themselves not addicted, viewing people who are with a pejorative sense that they need to do something about it. And at the highest level, there was Grover Cleveland at the time who said that Civil War widows were not entitled to pensions from deceased husbands if they had died while under the influence of opium. And so even the widows were prohibited from collecting a pension because it was viewed that their husband should have been able to come out of his own opium use. And so they were punished. And again, you just have to understand at the time, people didn't fully grasp the nature of the medication and how it works with your brain to create pathways that seek the drug.
Right.
And so they were punished, including the widows, and that was a big problem.
It was, as we'll learn tomorrow when we talk about the family dynamic during the Civil War, we'll learn just how important those pensions were in establishing any kind of well-being to the family that remained. The pension from the Civil War was just a central linchpin to any hope for a lot of times these families being able to carry on. So when Grover Cleveland did that, it was a severe punishment, and as Donna mentioned, it largely illustrated how it was viewed as a weakness to a large degree as opposed to an addictive illness. And it made it that much more difficult at the time.
The thing about the pension too that we want to discuss tomorrow, but also to make people aware of as if you are interested, as we have been, in collecting collecting information on your relatives who may have served during any of the wars, including the Civil War. The treasure that you find if you request the pension records. We did that for WG, and it took us about 6 weeks during the COVID, our COVID years, 6 or 8 weeks, and from the time that we requested the records until we received them. We have been alerted to this by a friend of ours we've come to know, who's an historian, also real focused on the African American component and dimension of the Civil War. But she said, oh, you've got to get the pension records. And so she said, be prepared. You might get 100 pages. Sure enough, we got 110 pages of pension records.
It's remarkable.
And yeah, and within it was all all photocopied, but you get so much detail. And I think that we paid about I'm thinking it might be $85 to get that, but it was so worth it. So anyway, what happened with WG as time went on? He lost a lot. He lost family members, which we'll explore a bit more tomorrow. He lost his vitality through his opium addiction. The elements that led him to try opium for the first time, that led his physician to give it to him, remained with him. He still had issues, and after he had left the service and his family, they had moved to Kansas. We didn't get to this yesterday, but they moved to Kansas. They were building railroads in Kansas at the time, and that was one draw for him. You could also obtain some farmland if you worked it for 5 years or more, later being known as kind of the Homestead Act. But he went out there with his family, and he was still heavily involved in the use of opium and was tempted by other what he called worldly pleasures. And Bill can tell us a little bit about what those worldly pleasures were for him.
Yeah, just to give you some idea of the sort of moral character of this man, he was suffering uh, self-guilt over playing checkers and going on fishing trips with friends. And so his his threshold for worldly pursuits that were to be avoided was fairly low. Um, but that's the kind of guy he was. And as we touched on yesterday, when he sought remuneration for having funded the recruiting and training of the first troops, the first black troops in Washington, D.C., he kept meticulous records. And ultimately, what was submitted to Congress for reimbursement was for $843, which at the time was a substantial sum of money. But it also showed the level of preciseness, and he had very high standards for himself.
Which,
And
yeah, which he and the Kansas experience, what happened is he had always had what he referred to as blooded horses and Morgan horses, particularly. And when they went to Kansas, he got involved, in addition to playing checkers and fishing, with trading in blooded horses. And that weighed heavily on him too. And I'm not fully cognizant of why that all those components were so challenging. Part of it was his Baptist faith, his Baptist roots. But what happened when they got to Kansas, two things. He was kind of like Forrest Gump, where he ended up in these big moments in time as a regular guy. And he ended up in Kansas. It's kind of unbelievable, really, but he had a couple churches that he was preaching at. He had a farm, and he was helping with securing money for the railroads. And he started to become a little uncomfortable with how that process was going, the money, how it was exchanging hands. He started to not trust that things were going all, copacetic, above board. So anyway, he kind of retreated from the railroad pursuits. But his wife, his second wife, Lumanda, became ill, and she was a youngish woman who now she had 6 children with him, but she became ill, and she wanted to return from Kansas to Pennsylvania, where her father still lived. Her mother had passed away, to the farm she had grown up on. And he wanted to assist her in that. And so he sold some of those blooded horses, and he went back with his wife, and his wife died. And W.G. remained in Pennsylvania for a year, describing himself as a grave worshiper. He was at her graveside. In so many ways, the life that he had developed over the years. Now he was in his probably late 40s, early 50s, addicted to opium, losing his wife, being at her graveside. So much of what he had known had evaporated. And crushing blow, number 500, there was a grasshopper plague in Kansas. So when he returned to Kansas, the grasshopper plague hit. And what that meant, when we say grasshoppers, they called them locusts too, but the drought conditions in the farther west had created a situation where these locusts were moving to find food, and they would fill the sky, and the sound was so scary, so overwhelming. People did not know what it was. And they could eat, how much of do you remember the corn thing? It was like they could eat it.
Denude a 40-acre farm field in
like an hour.
Like an hour, yeah. They could just literally devour an entire field of crops in about an hour.
And for WG, they ate the farm equipment, that like the handles of anything that had human sweat on it, they would be drawn to, they could eat. There was a tale of a woman being outside wearing a dress that had polka dots, and it was green, and they consumed that item of clothing. So all the promise of the move to Kansas went really horribly south, and he ended up really bereft. And so in his struggle, what his mindset was after he had returned to Kansas, he did help raise some funds for the relief efforts in Kansas. And then he felt a compulsion, almost like a moth to the light, to go back to Washington, D.C. And if we think of this, now he's alone. His quest is to return to the city where he had known so many very good friends. He had been in a position of knowing the leaders of the day. He had been with President Lincoln.
Right.
He had knew senators, and
Exactly.
he got things done.
He was intermeshed with the leaders of the time, and he was very well respected and entrusted to take on some pretty important tasks. Right. And now he literally is a completely broken man. His family basically gone. He had no real career at that point to speak of, and he was hopelessly addicted at that point. So he was ground zero. And,
yeah, he was a mess.
He thought perhaps by going back to Washington, D.C., where he had some time in the sun and had done pretty well, might trigger some kind of revival within him. And so he did. He went back to Washington.
And he chose to rent a small room. And what he had in the room, as he describes it, was the Bible, a hymnal. He relied or, got by eating bread and milk. Probably supposedly helped his stomach too. So in that condition, he made the decision to leave that room. And there was a place that he had been drawn to in Rock Creek Park. It's being called Pulpit Rock. He called it Bethel. It was a place that he could go to think and to feel connected to God as he understood God to be. And so he left this little room, and he took his gun, and he had a broadcloth suit that he would wear. He wore his suit. There was something else he took. I'm trying to think what it was. But essentially he took his gun, he took his Bible. He took the Bible that the president of then Hamilton Theological and Literary School had given him, now Colgate University. He took that, and he found his way to this spot, and he really was at the end of his rope, and he had determined that he was going to find a spot on that warm ground and just recline there, and he was determined to either be healed or to end his life. And the way he describes it, the way we put it forth in our book about him, it was really unbelievable. He held in his mind everyone he had loved. In a way, he was kind of preparing to say goodbye, I think. And he realized in that process that he needed to forgive certain people, and he made that kind of peace with the people in his past that he had held some animosity toward. And what happened was a strangest thing, in that as he prayed, and this went on for hours, as he prayed, at one point he felt the pain leaving his body. I mean, he literally could feel like a healing coming through his entire body. And he got up. The other thing he had taken was his cane, but he got up and he could move without any assistance, which he hadn't been able to do for some time. And he felt the feeling, the compulsion to take opium leave him. And from that moment forth, his life. I mean, there was not easy, I'm sure, but he never relapsed. He didn't have his ailments any longer. He lived remaining years free of the addiction and free of his ailments, which we understand is, of course, rare.
And he felt drawn back to his faith and to uh, evangelize, and he went out and faith healed, and he was so um, had such gratitude for being relieved of this addiction.
So on the broader front, now that the world, or at least in the United States, there's a clear awareness that the drugs that could help people could also really hurt them. There was a renewed effort to crack down on the medication. And in 1905, the US Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act that required labeling on all medicines. That was kind of a first pass. By now, W.G. had passed away. He died at the age of 73 or 4 in 1893. And then they came up, there was the Hague Convention of 1912 that obligated countries to regulate opium traffic. And there had been a lot of opium moving around on the water, on the ocean. But that was now efforts to regulate it. And you can see some of the parallels in our present time as well. And then Congress passed what's known as the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914, which was the first comprehensive law that was brought about to regulate all of the drugs that were similar to opium, including opium, which would be morphia, as I said. And so then we look to today, and I've read Dope Sick. We've read a lot of books, and here in Ohio, especially in Southern Ohio, but it's everywhere. There've been tremendous tales of the sweep of addiction, and
It was kind of an epicenter of the recent epidemic, or not
yeah,
recent, but the epidemic over the last decades. Ohio was kind of ground zero in a lot of that.
yeah, and here we are all these years later, still grappling with the use of opium, um, the regulation of it. And I do want to make a special shout out. And also, if you do have questions, I hope that you'll put them in the chat and we'll take a hold of them. But there's a young man named Jonathan Jones, and he is a Civil War medical historian. And he's on YouTube. He's the only person that I'm fully aware of that we've been able to encounter who his whole focus is on looking at the Civil War and the use of opiates during the Civil War and what that meant then and what it means today. And he's a scholar and he's done a lot of work. And if you look up anything related to Civil War use of opium, you're going to see Jonathan Jones's name attached to it. I've listened to him on YouTube on many different occasions, and Bill's familiar with him too. He's really the leading authority on the Civil War and the use of opium, which leads us to the phrase, and whether or not George said this, it was those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And we've thought of that so many times in the course of doing our research and writing on WG.
Yes, we have, definitely. And with that, we just want to thank you, but also entertain any questions that you may have. I mentioned this yesterday. Writing the book WG was a life experience for us, but even greater than that is the ability to get out and share the story and to talk to people that appreciate history. And that's something we always enjoy doing, and we're very grateful for the opportunity today to be able to do that with you. And I will throw out there also, Barbara, that that was a lot of information we unfurled in a short period of time. And if, also if there are any questions that emerge later or after they think it over or read the book or whatever, we're always available to respond as well.
Okay, I was wondering if you could put in the chat box the website you went to get these pension records. Where
Oh,
did you
Oh,
go?
yes.
If you could
Okay.
put that in the chat box, that might help
we will
others.
definitely.
Yeah, let me look for that while we might consider other questions.
Okay, somebody's asking, do you have any other examples of somebody slash institutes who benefit from your mentioned hospitals? I'm not really sure what he's trying to say.
Okay, what I can tell you in the meantime is the main source, the main place to go to get the records is to go to the National Archives. Just go into the National Archives, and as soon as you go into the National Archives, along the left corridor of it is research. And in that very first block, it says order copies. And if you click on order copies, it'll tell you if you're looking for, if you can ask for genealogical or family history records. You can ask for military service records. You can ask for microfilm rolls. But what we asked for were the military service records in the form of pensions. And as I say, at the time, it was around $85 to have that done. And during COVID, they had irregular hours. And so they would say, I think that it might take a little longer to get them. And today I don't know how long that would take. But for us, it was about 6 to 8 weeks before we got the packet of information. And as I say, it was very much worth it. But go to the National Archives. And I can try and put this. It's archives. How do we put this up? I don't know.
Let me just see if
Archives.
I'll type it in here. I don't know if
Okay.
it'll be a hot link or not.
Archives.gov/research.
.gov
Yeah, .gov /research /order. I see one good question there too. Okay, the first going back to Joyce's question, about the people who benefited from the trade in the early years. There was the Perkins family up in Boston. And when I say the Boston Brahmins, when you go back through and see who were included, meaning it was the most powerful elite group of people, those that had the most money back in the 1700s, late 19th century. They were called the Boston Brahmins, and they were the elite. And so many of them were involved in one way or another, legitimately and even not legitimately. There were relationships that developed with the Chinese. The opium was moving. It's been grown in poppy. It moved to China, and they were trading with the Chinese, and they paid them off, some of the big names. And surprisingly, some of the people that we know, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but famous people, leaders, were using opium in the day. I'm going to try and type this in just to see. Yes, okay. Some of the writers, and maybe that's not so surprising, because writers, have often, not all writers, but writers have been considered to be among those who might abuse alcohol, because it can be a lonely pursuit. But they mentioned John Keats, a writer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, even some of the leaders of our
Right.
upper level.
And then, there's a fascinating docudrama that's on television right now, and I think it might be Netflix.
Yeah,
Painkillers, it's called, and
it's
it's a
serious.
critical review of the recent epidemic around OxyContin, which is an outgrowth of all of this. And for those that are familiar with the story, it was Purdue Pharma combining a couple of narcotics to create a new drug that they wanted to be very much infiltrated through the society, and it was a fascinating documentary on who benefited, and obviously Purdue did for some time, and then were eventually driven to bankruptcy, but because of the outcomes of the lawsuits and so forth. But it was a fascinating look at how it took hold in particularly in the state of Ohio. They covered that for quite a bit as well. But that gives you a lot. I mean, there were a lot who benefited and still benefit from the misuse of this drug. And it's not to say it doesn't have its use, but it's very clearly the misuse of it that has been the problem, obviously. And I did see a question that's a very good question from yesterday's presentation about when Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wrested control back, or at least in his mind, of the African American military effort in the Union Army, which he felt was kind of getting out from under him. And I mentioned that Lincoln appointed W.G. Raymond and J.D. Turner to be colonel and lieutenant colonel of the First District of Columbia Colored Volunteers, which was the precursor to the first United States colored troops. Edwin Stanton felt that was highly irregular, and that Lincoln had, despite being commander in chief, he had outstepped his bounds in Stanton's mind. Why didn't Lincoln come to his defense or come to W.G.'s defense? Things were happening at a breakneck pace at that point. Lincoln and Stanton had a very complicated relationship, and it was one of choose your battles kind of thing. Stanton has been documented to divulging to others that he felt that Lincoln was a bit of a rube, that he was a bit of a country boy that didn't know what he was doing or got in over his head or whatever. But Lincoln, we all know, was more than that. And Lincoln was aware of this characterization of his. And, I've argued that Lincoln used that to his advantage in many situations. He could play that up, sly like a fox kind of thing. But with Stanton, they had to choose their battles. I think Lincoln recognized that he may have encroached at least Stanton's perceived turf as far as moving ahead on the African American troops in District of Columbia. Stanton was clearly almost at the point of a meltdown over how fast things were happening, and he felt he was losing control. And I think it's more a case of, Stanton made his point. He moved the troops out to the Anastolan Island. He stuck his people in. And I think Lincoln, at the end of the day, Lincoln's primary objective was to introduce federal troops of African American soldiers. He reached that position, and I think it was one of Lincoln didn't want Stanton or himself to be distracted by feuding over who takes command of these troops. But it's very difficult to find explicit reasoning. We found uh, much documentation of W.G. Raymond being appointed by Lincoln and Stanton being upset about it. But in the aftermath, there was not a lot. And of course, Lincoln, when W.G. took his case, or a senator actually did for him years later to try to get reimbursed for those 3 weeks. And a bill was introduced. We have a copy of the bill, and it was, shut down in the War Claims Committee. But it was long after Lincoln had been assassinated. So many who were close to that. Oh, and J.D. Turner died very shortly after having been appointed colonel of the original group by Lincoln. So it was really through attrition and death and so forth. There were very few around who remembered it. Now, there were a couple of senators that took up W.G.'s cause to sponsor the bill and so forth. But it was really, I think at the time, it was Lincoln stepping back and picking his battles at the time. And he felt by acquiescing to Stanton's desire to stick his own general in there, at least, he's moving forward with black troops, and Stanton had established the United States Colored Troops, and May 22nd of 1863 became a very important date. And Lincoln went on to state before his assassination that he was of the firm view that the Union would not have been victorious without the United States Colored Troops, not only in the messaging that was sent, but in their actual actions on the battlefield. So it was a heady time, a very complex time, and W.G. paid the price of getting in the middle of a turf war, essentially, between Lincoln and Stanton. And he really came out on the short end of that, owing to the fact that there were larger battles to be fought at the time. It's the best we can conclude, but a great question, and that's one that we've pondered quite a bit.
And I did want to go back because I've been able to check my notes, and these names of the people from Boston that I called the Boston Brahmins, some names you might have heard about who were involved in the opium trade at the time and put their names on hospitals and libraries in the Boston area, included the Cabots, the Lowells, Perkins was a big one, Forbes, Cushings, and the Delanos, who were related to a future president. So that was additional. And then how did people get opium during the Civil War? It was a manufactured medication that was available and widely used. It didn't require prescription. You could buy it in the drugstores. You could buy it from Sears. It was widely available, like aspirin, as you would potentially think of today.
Right.
There's another question here on up. What was his relationship with his children during all the time that he was addicted?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. And this will get into a little bit more in terms of how unusual was this during the timing of our relative's life. But what happened, he lost his first wife. She passed when she was quite young and left two young children. They were they were both under 2 when their mother died. So they were farmed out to 2 other families who had said they would take responsibility for educating them and so forth. Then W.G. did not have a close bond with them until later. And later in time, he reconnected with the son who had been adopted by another family, and that son became a missionary and he went to Jamaica. He was in Kingston, Jamaica. His name was Edwin Raymond. And he was there for a long time. And in 1905, he developed encephalitis, and he ended up passing on the island. And they didn't want to release his body. He was buried at sea there because they have different beliefs about, like at the time, evil spirits, and they wanted to keep his being there. And W.G. connected with that daughter. They went on to work together in the latter part of W.G.'s life, in the very latter part, after he was free of his addiction. She and he worked together in this faith healing ministry. He had children with his second wife, Lumanda, and she too passed away at a fairly young age, which I had mentioned. She wanted to go home to her father's to be buried there and to die there, which she did. Those children, by the time they were of age, his two eldest daughters remained in Kansas and married others from Kansas. And then they took care of there was a younger son who was probably 14, 13 at the time. They took care of him. But W.G. did maintain relationship with all of his children, except the last two. He had a marriage to a third woman, which we only found in the most circuitous of ways. And it was largely through those pension records that I mentioned there. And the third wife he was married to, he didn't speak of, to be honest. And we don't fully understand yet what that is about. We can give you some ideas on that tomorrow. But the basic sense was that at age 60, almost 60, he had two children with that woman. And they went on to live in California. And one of the women we've gotten acquainted with, who's a descendant, and we have connected in the last 3 years, she came through that branch. So we found our relative after all of these years, and she knows the story, and she's been real supportive of our work. But his children, he loved fiercely. He wrote about his love of them, but the times were such, and his own life was such, that he had periods where he wasn't as close to them, and then periods where he certainly was.
I'd like to just say I'm looking for a professor at Marist who might want to give a course on this. So therefore, I may, if I find somebody, I am going to try anyway to get a small amount of books, your first book.
Certainly. Yeah,
and
we can
put it
help
there
with
in
that.
the Marist bookstore.
That would be wonderful.
We can do that.
That would be wonderful. We'd be
Because
very happy
all
to
of this in 2 days doesn't equal sitting down and reading it now and then and being able to go back and
Right.
everything.
No, that would be wonderful.
Well, we really appreciate the time, and we do want to tell you, when we started this project, we did not know where we would go with it. And if you have any interest in your own family's history, or it started with us just, granted, we had his own manuscript, which was a starting point for sure, but what you can find out in the public domain is fascinating.
Yeah, the internet has really obviously changed the game in terms of research and access to information. And it's just mind-boggling what you can get into. And it's opened a door that we had no idea what all was on the other side. So as Donna said, we would highly encourage anyone that had that inkling to do so. I do see a question on where you can get your book. Thank you. You can get this book anywhere that you like to buy. It's on Amazon or bookshop.org, or you can go to
Barnes and
your
Noble
Barnes and Noble. You can go to your bookstore. They'll order it for you if they don't have it.
and libraries.
And libraries. There are several libraries that hold it. So thank you so much for your interest. We really do appreciate it.
Okay, there's one question. I think we may have passed by it.
Oh,
And it was, where did they obtain the opium?
Okay.
oh yes, I'm
then-
sorry, I tried to touch on that. It was manufactured. Ultimately, it came from poppies in largely in Afghanistan and in that area where the climate was
Far
right.
East.
And then China traded it, but at the time of the Civil War, we were manufacturing it here in the United States.
There's a company called Bigelow's.
Yeah,
And
and they had purified opium.
they made purified, Bigelow made purified opium out of, the trade ships would come in with the poppy and, whatever state it was in, but it would be manufactured here in the United States, and it was distributed, as Donna mentioned at one point, through Sears. And, the way to look at it, I mean,
It's like aspirin.
it's like aspirin or Tylenol. You just go down to your local pharmacy, or not even there, the grocery store, and get it. It was readily available with no regulation. And there were a handful of manufacturers that made it, and Bigelow being one of them. They distributed it. The government would obtain it for use in the Army hospitals, and family members would get it for their, injured family members. It was readily available. And it was just remarkable to us that it was.
Yeah, and the word that always came to mind was it's insidious, because it was understood to relieve pain, which it did, and they certainly needed something that could help. But the challenge was, in the way most insidious things happen, the downside was you could become addicted rather quickly,
Yeah.
and people did, and then no one knew what to do with them when they were addicted.
Right.
And we're still grappling with that 160 years later, trying to find the best way to prevent it, to address it when it occurs. There are a lot of regulations now, as we know, that hasn't necessarily created a path to no problem, as we all know. So it's quite fascinating. But again, I reference Jonathan Jones if you want to dig into it more, because he's the scholar who's really got.
He's done the work.
Yeah,
Right.
he's got a lot of good information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if anybody has any more questions, type them in soon. If not, I want to thank you again, Donna, Bill. Thank you very much.
Right back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful, we enjoy this and really appreciate the opportunity today. Appreciate your time.
So we will see you both tomorrow, and everyone in the class. I sent out a note last night reminding folks about today's class and tomorrow's class.
Thank you.
So this time we got a lot of good questions.
We did, and we really appreciate that too.
Yeah, much appreciated, and we look very much forward to tomorrow.
Okay.
Best wishes to y'all.
Best wishes to everyone.
Thank you all.
CLS.
Take care.
Bye-bye.